Hello, Women of Welcome. I'm Sarah Quezada, and I'm so excited that Matthew Sorens from World Relief is joining us today. So we welcome you, Matt, to our Women of Welcome group. You have an invitation to join us and be a part of this group of women.
Actually, I'm glad to be with you.
Yes, so glad you're here. And Matt is such a great partner and resource with what we're doing here at Welcome. So we connect with their work at World Relief, and he does a lot of equipping churches to understand more about what's happening with immigrants and refugees in our communities. And so this week's reading in our Ruth and Naomi study that we've been walking through really focuses on refugees. And so that's why we invited Matt to join us to give us a bit of a snapshot of what is happening currently. If you've been watching the news, you know, the Refugee Resettlement Program, we invited many of you all to speak up and speak out about that last fall, as well as just very recently with the local consent thing. So we want to kind of dive into all of that and get a picture from Matt of what is going on. So starting with last fall, when we talked about the refugee ceiling, which is the cap or the limit that of refugees the U.S. agrees to resettle in a year, we were encouraging women to advocate for no less than 50,000, which did not happen. So maybe Matt, you can speak to where we are now with that and what the reality of that limit looks like.
Yeah, so ultimately, the president set the annual ceiling. So that's a maximum number of refugees who can be resettled, not at 50,000, which should have been lower than normal in U.S. history, but at 18,000. So a really low number. It's a historically low number. And that's where we're at. That governs the federal fiscal year that begins October 1st and goes through September 30th of this year.
And for historical context, how long has the Refugee Resettlement Program been in existence?
So there's sort of an informal refugee resettlement program before this, but it was formalized by the Refugee Act of 1980. And so 1980 was the first year that the president, in that case, it was still President Carter before during the elections of 1980, had to set a ceiling. And he set the ceiling for FY 1980 at, I think it was 231,700. So just historically, we're at less than 1/10 of that number for the ceiling this year. And it is always important to remember that that's a ceiling. It's not a floor. So we don't know how many refugees will come in until we get to the end of the year. That's a function of how the pace at which the State Department is processing people, as in other parts of the federal government as well. The USCIS does some of the screening and vetting. I actually ran the numbers this morning just to see, well, how are we doing so far? We're about a third of the way. At the end of January, we'll be a third of the way through the federal fiscal year, 4 months in. And precisely as of today, 4,451 refugees have been resettled this fiscal year. So if you project that out, which may not be fair to do because sometimes the pace picks up or slows down in the middle of the year, but we'd be a little bit short of the 18,000 ceiling if things continue. Now that we should also take into account there's actually no refugees resettled the entire month of October.
I was going to ask that because I remember that messaging coming out that flights were being canceled and there was some question, will we be resettling anyone? But it sounds like we have been resettling.
We have been since the beginning of November. Basically, under the law, there's no authority to resettle refugees until the president signs that annual declaration. And even though the State Department basically announced, I believe in September, that the ceiling would be 18,000, the president didn't sign that formally until I think it was the first day of November, and that allowed the process to reopen and flights have been canceled. In some cases to be rebooked, but also whenever there's a disruption like that, there are background checks that have like a certain expiration date, like this is valid for 30 days or 90 days. And you had people who were literally booked on a plane with plane tickets to arrive in the middle of October who then were not eligible as of the beginning of November when it became possible for them to come in because they had to restart that vetting process or a medical screening. Or even there was a few cases of unaccompanied minor refugee children who turned 18 because of that delay and no longer count as refugee children under the law. So they are basically, they could potentially be considered to come as adults, but that's a whole separate process.
Oh, wow. I was not aware of that. That is super disheartening because, for that, the refugee process, the vetting process already takes several years, correct?
And they had been in that. And again, don't get much more vulnerable than an unaccompanied refugee. So you're probably an orphan as well as a refugee. And there are families waiting to be foster parents, somewhere in the United States who those plans had to be reconsidered because of the delay there.
Because of the delay. Wow. Yeah, that's hard to hear. But I'm curious too, so one of the things that we were hearing at the time that we were advocating for a higher ceiling was that this would have an impact on our resettlement infrastructure across the country, as well as families who maybe had someone coming to meet them. Can you kind of speak to some of those impacts of the refugee ceiling?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S., I think, should be proud. Over 40 years, we've built an infrastructure primarily of nonprofit organizations, most of them faith-based, like World Relief or the Catholic Bishops or Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services or others, who work with local churches and other community organizations to help refugees in that process of integrating into a new community. And I wish actually that all immigration in the United States was so smooth and organized, and there was that help from the receiving community to help people enter in. I think it's been a really amazing process, and that infrastructure has been built up over 40 years, but it is sustained in part by federal funding that has gone down dramatically because it's a per refugee grant. And so when the number of refugees being resettled goes from almost 100,000 in 2016 to now about maximum 18,000 in this fiscal year. We're at World Relief, we've closed 7 of our offices. We're still in about 15 offices, and a few of those we're no longer doing refugee resettlement. We're still serving refugees with legal services or education or other services, and we would love to resume that if we had the opportunity. But we, like our peer organizations, basically had too much capacity for the very small number of refugees who were being allowed to arrive. Part of my job is telling churches, yeah, I'm sorry, we don't actually have a family arriving for your team to meet and befriend, but maybe you'd like to help this family that's been in the country for 5 years that's still struggling with English, or there are still certain needs, and I want people to be really clear on that. We still need church-based volunteers. There's still ways to serve refugees in your community, but it might not look like meeting a family at the airport, which was kind of our flagship ministry 3 years ago.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And it feels like something I wanted to touch base on was part of the rationale for drastically reducing and sort of tightening up the refugee program was this idea that the vetting process needed to be evaluated and recalibrated, perhaps. And so maybe you can speak to some of the misunderstanding about the vetting process, but then also what, if any, changes have occurred in the last few years around that process.
Yeah. Whenever I hear, well, we need to have a strong vetting process for refugees, I say, amen. I've been the person meeting refugees at the airport. I want them to be good people. I've literally had refugees living in my house for a year at a time from the Middle East. I want them to be the right people. I'm just not at all convinced, based on any of the data, that we have lacked that process, especially post 9/11. There's all sorts of improvements to the vetting process. It's a very thorough and frankly somewhat burdensome process for those refugees, but for good reasons. The U.S. takes very seriously its obligation, yes, to be a compassionate country, but also to respect the security and protect the security of American citizens. What's, I think, a misconception is that there's been some sort of significant failure there. The reality is, since the Refugee Act passed in 1980, there's been roughly 3 million refugees resettled to the United States through that program, and not a single one of them has taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack. That's actually a pretty impressive record. That's not to say they're all perfect people. They're a mix of people, just like everybody, but they don't have serious criminal issues because they've been thoroughly vetted in advance. They make the very, very tight selection process to be resettled to the U.S. And that's very tight now, but it was very tight under President Obama or President Bush as well. Historically, the U.S. resettles about 0.5% of the world's refugees each year. Now it's closer to 0.1% of the world's refugees, but it's never been most refugees got to come to the United States. The very small share that are even considered based on usually unique vulnerabilities. And then they begin this vetting process that usually would take somewhere between 18 months and 3 years to complete.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big misconceptions about the refugee program is that we are not by far taking the majority of refugees. And relatedly, that refugees do not select the U.S. to be resettled.
Yeah.
They are assigned here through the broader Refugee Resettlement Program globally.
Yeah, that's. I mean, people, if they get offered a chance to the United States, most of them are very pleased with that. But I mean, others get selected to go to Canada, and almost anyone who gets selected to go anywhere is thrilled, because the vast majority get selected to wait in a camp or wait in an urban context where they're not allowed to work indefinitely, sometimes for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I read a book called Once We Were Strangers by Sean Smucker, and he talks about a friendship he struck up with a refugee man who'd been resettled in his town. And one of the things that really stuck out to me with that book was when he shares and reminisces about his time in refugee camps and just the sheer boredom and lack of you're not doing anything day to day, and you don't know what you will be doing a week or a month or a year from now.
A former colleague of mine who is he's from Burundi originally. He's super smart young guy, knew a bunch of languages, was helping the UN, and then got on the wrong side of some bad people. Ended up fleeing as a refugee, but he lived in this refugee camp in Ethiopia for many years before being chosen for a settlement. Ended up in Spokane, Washington. His name's Come, and he told me, refugee camps are one of the richest places in the world, but you have all this wealth, all this potential that's just locked up and can't be used. And it says some of the solutions to some of our world's problems are sitting locked in a refugee camp right now, unable to work legally, unable to contribute in the ways that God has equipped them to.
Yes, I think about that sometimes, of who are the friends I would have had, or the encounters I would have had if people had been allowed to, move out of those types of camps and situations. Yeah, which is maybe a weird thing to think about, but I do sometimes. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit too, because a lot of what we hear about the refugee program relates to persecuted Christians being relocated, as well as concerns potentially about Muslim refugees and sort of the disproportionality. And so we'd love to know how that has changed over the last couple of years, if at all.
Yeah. I mean, so the number of refugees coming is obviously down overall, but not every group is down at the same rate. So the number of Christian refugees is down of any background, whether they're persecuted for their Christian faith or they are persecuted for their ethnicity and they happen to be a Christian. Those numbers are down, but they're not down as dramatically as the number of Muslim refugees are. And part of that is regional as well. So there's almost no refugees arriving from the Middle East today. In fact, I pulled the numbers this morning.
I didn't realize that.
There's been about 4,500 refugees, as I said, in the last 4 months since October 1st. 275 of them have been from the Middle East. So a pretty small percentage compared to, if you look at the first 4 months of fiscal year 2017, so the exact same time period just 3 years ago. So
where are people predominantly coming from? Do you have that?
So now we're seeing more from, we're not seeing more, we're seeing fewer numbers, but the larger share from the Democratic Republic of Congo, still some from Burma, from the Ukraine as well. I think those are, I'm not sure if those are the top three, but they're in those three would be in the top five right now for sure, which have long been, significant numbers. But what you don't see now is Iraq or Iran or Syria or Somalia. Those would be countries, the first three in the Middle East and then one in Africa. Which are Muslim majority countries. Although it's also really important to note that you're a refugee from a Muslim majority country doesn't mean you are a Muslim.
True.
For example, the majority of refugees coming from Iran over the last 10 years have actually been Christians, because they're largely people who are refugees specifically because of religious persecution, almost entirely. So the majority are Christian, also a minority of Jewish refugees, of Mandayans who are a minority religion. They're not Christians, but they're not Muslims. They're neither. Those numbers are down 95% from 2016 to 2019. The number of Iraqi Christians, and I mean, Christians are a minority in Iraq. They're also a minority of the refugees resettled from Iraq, but only not that much of a minority. They're 35% of all Iraqi refugees historically in the last 10 years have been Christians. And as most people are aware, Christians in Iraq are facing genocide. I mean, it's a very, very serious situation. And that's why Christians are such a large share of the refugees, much higher than their share of the population. But those numbers are down 95% from 2016 to 2019 as well. So Muslims are certainly disproportionately negatively affected by this decline, but so are Christians from Muslim majority countries, including Iraq, Iran, Syria, Pakistan. Even Burma, which is not a Muslim majority country, it's a Buddhist majority country. It's in the last 10 years been the #1 country of origin for refugee resettlement to the US. And about 70% of those refugees have been Christians. Again, it's their Christian faith that is a significant factor in why they are persecuted by the Burmese government, also known as Myanmar, and why they end up fleeing often to camps in Thailand or living as urban refugees in Malaysia. Their numbers are down really dramatically over the last few years as well. To the point of, it was 10,000 Christian refugees per year for many years from Burma. Last year, in 2019, it was about 3,400. So pretty significant decline in that population as well. So, people ask, well, is it true that more Christian refugees are coming? No. It is true that Christians are now a higher share of all the refugees who are coming, but the overall numbers are down so dramatically, and that's affecting Muslims, but also Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and others.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Speak to us a little bit about what we've been hearing in the news recently with local governors and counties and different municipalities having to opt in to refugee resettlement, and sort of where we're at with that and what that means.
Yeah, so first of all, I should say resettlement agencies like World Relief have been consulting with and coordinating with local and state governments forever. That's always been something we do on a regular basis, and that we would want to do, but also that we're required to do by the rules for refugee resettlement. What has not been required in the past is explicit consent to ongoing refugee resettlement by the state governor or the county executive. In the fall, the president signed a new executive order basically making that a new requirement. And basically it was a governor must submit a letter saying I would consent to ongoing resettlement, or resettlement will stop. So it was a neutral position, was basically a veto. You had to effectively assent in, and that was both for the governor, which of course is for the whole state, and then for a county executive. So that would, if a county executive says no, but a governor says yes, you still can't have anyone go into that county. If a governor says no, but a county executive says yes, nobody can come into that county because they're part of the state.
Can't come to the state. I see.
So we, as a resettlement agency, we're waiting for more information on how this was going to work. We finally got that, and basically we're scrambling to get governors to send these letters. And the good news is more than 40 governors said, yes, of course we still want refugees. And that about half of them are Republicans. We were actually really encouraged by the level of support, and including a lot of governors who, for example, Governor Lee in Tennessee, who sent that letter explicitly mentioning their Christian faith. In Governor Lee's case, his wife is involved in a ministry in Nashville with Kurdish refugees from Iraq, and he said, we're not going to turn our back on these people, many of whom are widows whose husbands were killed because of their service to the U.S. military. So that's the good news. The bad news is one state's governor said no. That was Texas. We had a few states we're still waiting on. Georgia, where I know you're at, Sarah, we hadn't heard. And then what I think is also good news is then a week or two ago, probably 2 weeks now, a judge in Maryland issued an injunction, a nationwide injunction on that executive order, basically for a number of very compelling reasons, said this executive order can't go forward, at least until we have time to hear the whole case, because it's pretty likely that it's not constitutional. The Constitution makes immigration a federal prerogative. That is to say, you can't have different states with different immigration policies. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless we're going to erect walls between, Oklahoma and Texas. So at the moment, that executive order is not in effect, and we continue to consult with states and local governments. We can continue to resettle refugees, for example, at our office at World Relief Fort Worth. The mayor, by the way, really wants refugees, and there's been lots of support at the local level, but where the governor had indicated he did not want ongoing resettlement. We will continue barring until there's a further decision from the court. There's not a final decision yet. This is what's considered a temporary injunction. Okay. But the way our court system works, it could be a year or more before we would get to a final rule on that.
Final decision. Yeah, interesting. That was something, your statement about different states having different immigration laws, that was something I had heard in response when the governor of Texas came out saying, no, we're not going to allow refugees, was people can be resettled anywhere in the US, but they don't have to stay there. So they're, but as a state, you're potentially missing out on some of the funding that you would receive for resettling refugees. And they might still, if they have family members or connections in your state, might still come anyway once they arrive.
That's one of the primary reasons. I mean, of course, we didn't want to have to tell our church partners in Fort Worth, you have to stop your ministry. That was one reason we were concerned about this. Or at least the Ministry of Initial Refugee Resettlement. We weren't going to close up had this gone through. We just serve immigrants in other ways. But we also think it's short-sighted because a refugee is they're lawfully residing in the United States. They can move anywhere they want from day zero that they arrive. And if your brother lives in Fort Worth and you can't be sent there because of this new policy and you get sent to California, you're probably going to move to Fort Worth on day zero, which is probably net a good thing. You're going to do better living with your brother. Just like if one of us had to flee our country and land somewhere else, we'd probably want to go where we happen to have a sibling or a cousin or whoever. But in doing so, you're basically abandoning the support of a resettlement agency, which is this nonprofit, faith-based organization that has a lot of experience with cultural adjustment, finding work, learning the language. All the things we've learned over the years really help refugees to adjust well, and as does their extended family. And to make them choose between those two is really short-sighted if our goal is for refugees to be well integrated into local communities. And again, that refugee family would land in California, probably move immediately to Texas, but the funds that the federal government provides to help support them wouldn't necessarily follow them to Texas because there's wouldn't be any resettlement programs there, presumably. So I think it's a good thing that the court ruled the way they did. I wish the governor in Texas wouldn't have made the decision he made, and I hope he might change his mind. I know he's getting a lot of feedback particularly from Christians, both evangelicals and Catholics. The Catholic bishops have been very outspoken against the decision in Texas. But I also really want to celebrate that, at least 40 plus governors of this country, including some very conservative states, have said, actually, we welcome refugees. We want them to be able to come to our state. We want churches to be able to continue to minister to them. Our companies actually really need their labor as well. They're important parts of our economy. I hope that's an affirmation for those, our many fellow citizens now who came to this country some years ago as refugees, or those who are not yet citizens, but who are our neighbors, who might understandably feel like the sort of statement the governor of Texas made is sort of it sort of implies that you're a burden we can't handle. And most other states say, no, actually, you're what makes this country strong.
Yeah, that is a really encouraging message that came out of the whole experience. Over 40 states is a really powerful statement. So that's really great. Thank you so much for this update and keeping us informed. And I know you are so engaged on a day-to-day basis with resettlement agencies and churches that are working with refugees. So it's really helpful to kind of get behind the headlines and hear what's happening. So thank you so much for your time, Matt.
Yeah, happy to do it. Good to see you.
All right, we'll talk again. Bye.